remember the first cold that settled into my bones, not weather, not wind. A quiet that comes after something breaks and won't take its shape again. Folks think a man gets used to silence out here, that prairie hush that sits on your shoulders like an old coat. But there's another kind. The kind that finds you even with the fire crackling and the coyotes carrying on, even with a horse nosing your palm for grain. That was the silence that took me 3 winters back. The winter I buried my wife and the child she never got to hold. A drift took the north line down. I was riding freight for cash I swore we needed. The snow started like feathers and turned to knives. I got home not to a lamp, but to a hush that never ends. Since then I've spoken more to the wind than to any living soul. It knows what I confess. It doesn't argue. It just takes. I rode into Willow Flats near dusk, the day the story I'm telling began. Low sun, red as a wound, laying out the hills in long shadows. Cottonwoods along the creek shivered with the last dry leaves. The town sits where 2 trails cross, and the earth turns to dust so fine it sticks to your tongue. I came in quiet, as I do. A man with enough miles on him learns the worth of quiet. The saloon gave a thin piano sound, something cheerful that didn't fool anybody. The mercantile's bell clinked when I pushed through. Smelled of lamp oil, mouse poison, dry flour. A couple women in church blacks stood near the bolts of cloth, talking low the way women do when their words aim to be knives, but want the law on their side. The clerk was a narrow man, hair parted like a fence line, cash drawer click, pencil scratch, the same math he'd do for a saint or a thief. She was there with 3 boys and eyes that had run out of sleep. You can tell a widow quick by the dress, but you learn the truth from the hands. Hers were split from cold and work, not a single ring mark. Either she never had one, or she let it go to keep her sons fed. The big boy had his fist tucked in his coat like he'd learned to hide the tremble. The middle one was counting cracked boards in the floor. The little one kept leaning toward a sack of sugar like it was a sunrise. She asked for flour, lard, a small sack of beans, a spool of thread if the price could bend. Her voice wasn't begging, but you could hear the bend in her days, how every hour had already been bartered. The clerk pulled the goods and stacked them like stones for a grave. He told her the number. She counted coins that held the heat of her hand and laid them out slow. Then she lifted her chin because she had more to say. Half now, half after she took in washing, she told him. The women in black pinched their mouths thin and looked at the clerk to do the kind thing or the right thing, whichever would keep their gossip clean. He didn't lift his eyes. He said the store keeps no ledger for promises. He said credit had a way of making the poor lazier than God meant. The big boy folded tighter. The little one looked up when the sack was pushed back out of reach. The mother gathered her coins like a woman scooping snow before it melts and leaves nothing but wet. I could have spoken. I could have paid. A man like me learns there's more weight in a gesture than in a speech. But there are places where a stranger's coin takes more than it gives, especially when the town has already judged the matter. So I slipped out with what I'd come for. I tied my mare behind the livery and crossed the creek at the shallows, where the stones show their backs like turtles. The air smelled of iron and mesquite smoke. In the east the sky had gone from purple to the black of a well. The ridge south of town has a cut in it, formed by some old water that left without saying goodbye. I rode up through the junipers and stopped where you can see the flats like a map a child might draw. That's where I make my decisions, where a man looks small enough to be honest with himself. They were still in the street when I glassed the town. The clerk was locking the door. The women had turned their backs like they were turning a page. The widow settled one boy on the little cart they had, and the older two took up the handles. The mail coach rattled past and laid a dust on them that would turn to mud if tears did what tears do. But she kept her face dry. When pride is all you own, you guard it like a flame in wind. They took the east track, the broken one that leads past the stockyards and then out to the waste ground, where folks raise tents first and hopes later. There are bodies in the dirt out there, and the ground knows all their names. I waited till the town lights lost them, then I eased down the backside of the ridge, kept the creek to my right, and let the mare pick her way along the sedges. Coyotes sang out in twos and threes. Not far off, a pair of cranes plucked at the black water, dragging ripples like comb lines through hair. I had a bundle I kept for nights when a human fire seemed too small against the sky. Canvas patches, a little lard I could spare, nails, a can of coffee, a book of matches sealed in wax. Things a man can give without asking the world's permission. I stowed them in a feed sack, tied it twice, and kept to the cottonwood shadows. She had made camp in a depression where the grass had thinned to silver stubble under wind. The tent was more hope than shelter. The boys worked the way children work, who have learned that the world doesn't stop to wait for 'em. The big one drove stakes with a rock like his arm had been a hammer all its short years. The middle one kept picking burrs from the blanket and piling them like tiny hearts torn from stubborn plants. The small one sat with his arms around his knees, humming to himself, trying to make his body into a smaller thing that hunger could pass by. The widow moved with care, steady, quiet. She spoke low, and the boys laid their task down when she spoke, the way simple men lay their tools aside when a bell rings. I backed the mare into the willows and stepped off. A night bird shifted. The creek slid over stones. I left the sack near where a boot would find it by accident and walked wider so my tracks wouldn't tell a tale. Sometimes the best a man can do is be the ghost of a good deed. The wind picked up a little, enough to move the cold around. You get to know the first breath of a storm if you've slept under enough of them. It was in the air that night, a small taste like tin between the teeth, the kind of storm that starts by making you humble and ends by making you honest. I stood a long time and watched them settle. The big boy looked toward town with a face made for arguing with the world, as if he'd already chosen a fight that would take years to finish. The middle one fell asleep on a pile of rope, cheeks striped by the twist. The little one kept drifting near the tent flap to see the stars and then back to the blanket because the stars were too many and too cold. The widow sat on her heels and rubbed her hands together in a slow circle, as if she were cradling a thing the world had broken, but not yet taken away. I thought of another woman's hands, and the way they would have held to mine if they'd been given one more morning. I told the wind again what I tell it each time. I should have been there. I should have chosen home. The wind, like always, took it and answered with nothing. I turned to leave, but the mare lifted her head and flicked an ear. A lantern was moving down the track from town, bobbing like a low star. Not one, 3. Men walk slow when they wanted to scare you with the time it took for them to arrive. I listened, and in the scrape of a boot and the hitch in a breath, I knew the kind of men they were. A ranch hand who wasn't paid in full, a thin cousin to someone with a badge, a liar with soft palms. Their talk carried. They had the sound of fellows who thought charity was sin and cruelty a favor. I found the shadow of a cottonwood and let it hold me. My hands went empty to show my heart. I didn't plan to shoot anyone whose name I didn't know, but my legs leaned, ready, the way a man leans when he remembers what the world did to him and can't bear for it to be done to someone else again. They came on with the kind of swagger men borrow from darkness. Lantern light swung across the grass, making the burrs shine like tiny teeth. I could hear their talk before I could see their faces clearly. One laughed in a high, empty way. Another kept clearing his throat, like he wanted a reason to spit and call it justice. The third didn't speak at all. I've learned to mind the quiet one. Trouble likes a mouth, but danger keeps its own counsel. The widow heard them when I did. She rose slow, dusted her palms against her skirt, and stood where the boys could see her face. The big one took a step forward. She put a hand out and set him back without words. The lanterns halted just shy of the low dip where the camp sat. Boots scuffed, then found stillness. Breath made 3 small white clouds. The quiet one set his lantern on a rock like a judge laying down a book. "Evening, missus," the throat clearer said. "We come to offer advice, seeing as you're new to our piece of earth." Advice is what men call it when they plan to take something but want to hear how their voices sound first. She said nothing at all, which was the right way to answer advice. The high laugh sniggered. "Town's got rules ain't written still. Rules." Lantern light touched their faces in slices. I knew the cousin, by the way. He kept one hand near his belt, though he wore no gun. I knew the ranch hand by the notch in his ear and the cheap pride in his stance. A boy playing at wolf. The quiet one had the flat eyes of someone who'd been given errands by meaner men his whole life and learned they all paid the same, a coin or a bruise. I waited long enough to hear whether they'd settle for scaring. Storm air thinned around us. First wind threading the cottonwoods like a warning whispered too late. The widow moved her hand just a touch toward the tent, a gesture telling the boys to stay put. Then she spoke, and her voice surprised me. It had iron, not big iron, a small rod worn by night fires and gripped tight by a tired hand. She thanked them for the concern. She said her name, which gave them a chance to say theirs like men. They did not. The high laugh said the only name that mattered in this part of the world was Mercer. He let it sit there, waiting to see if the syllables would make her swallow. Cyrus Mercer's holdings ran long as bad weather. He had men and paper and a smile that didn't include his eyes. I didn't need the name spoken to know whose shadow walked behind theirs, but hearing it brought back a set of tracks in my mind I'd hoped frost had filled long ago. "Mr. Mercer values order," the throat clearer said. "Makes a place safe. Costs money to keep order. Costs manners, too. Camping here, taking charity you haven't earned, leaning on the town's heart. Some would call that crooked." The big boy stepped again. I saw the tremor run his jaw and settle in a stubborn set. The widow's hand didn't waver. She told them she had coin for rent when washing came in, that she'd pay fair for every bite her sons took. The quiet one smiled in a small way. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the cart, the loose lashings, the tent seam half open near the ground where a child's blanket showed. His mind was counting what would be easy to take, what would be fun to topple. I let the mare breathe once to tell me what she thought. She swiveled an ear back to me, forward to the men, then shifted weight, like a friend preparing to stand when company turns sour. I stepped out of the cottonwood's left-hand shadow just enough to own the space by the creek. Lantern light found the shape of me without seeing the detail. Nights do that for a man. They grant him size and mystery if he moves, like he knows his own name. Evening, I said it wasn't loud, but a voice coming from where a man swore there was no man as like a match struck in a gin shed. Their heads snapped my way. The quiet one's hand went to a pocket, then fell. He couldn't place me. New danger always tastes different. I stayed 3 long strides from my rifle, letting the truth of my hands show. Empty, open. It is a trick as old as fences. You can't calm a skittish horse with a hard stare. You offer the soft of your palm and let the animal talk you into trusting it. "This a road?" I asked. "I'll step off it if it is." The throat clearer tried to gather himself and put sternness back on like a vest. "Private dealings, friend. No cause to stray into 'em." "Storm's coming," I said. "Only 'cause that matters. Folks ought to be tying down what they mean to keep." The high laugh snorted. "You a preacher?" he asked. "No, I said. "Preacher has to be sure." Wind sifted through the willows and leaned into the half-set tent. The widow watched me without showing it. She never asked for rescue. Some people pray by standing still. The big boy had lifted his chin. A young male believes that standing is the same as saving. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it gets your blood let into the ground where nothing needed it. The quiet one tried to smile again, thinner this time. "We just warning, mister. We're the decent side of trouble. Other side comes with fire." "Then you're early," I said. "My fire's for later. Tonight's for rope and stakes." He looked at the cart's wheel like he could think of 3 ways to snap it without using his hands. I took 1 slow step closer to their light, enough that the scar on my cheek might show, enough that my boots told their own long story. Men who take always think they're the first wolf to smell the lamb. Seeing a dog's bite marks on another wolf changes the arithmetic. "Whose man are you?" the cousin asked, meaning which ranch, which brand, which paper. That is how they classify a human here, the way a banker classifies horses. Qualities first, then debts. "No one's," I said, and the way I said it made the quiet one decide we were past talk. He reached for the cart's lash. The big boy moved. I moved. The quiet one's wrist found my hand before his fingers found the rope. I did not twist. I did not break anything. I squeezed. A steady and private thing, the kind of grip a man remembers in rain. He looked at me. The lantern threw a new light in his eyes, one that said he'd been alone in rooms where the window would not open. I eased off. He stepped back. The cousin's mouth worked, angry and not sure why. The ranch hand spread his stance and hooked his thumbs into his belt as if the gesture gave him rank. "You fond of these folks?" the cousin asked. "I don't know them," I said, "but I know a line when I see one. There's one right here." I drew my boot through the silt and made a mark between the camp and the men. The gesture is older than speech. Storm will wipe this out by morning. Till then we can pretend such things matter. The ranch hand laughed, then saw I wasn't laughing, and the laugh lost its footing. The quiet one rubbed his wrist. The cousin shifted, looking back the way they'd come to see if the town could see him being brave. The lanterns fluttered in the wind. A scrap of cloud crossed the moon and kept going. Somewhere upstream, a branch let go of the bank and bumped along the stones like a drunk that had lost his hat. "We'll talk to Mercer, huh, Maggie?" the cousin said, trying a new road. "He'll decide." "Maybe," I said. "Till then they'll sleep." "You aim to stand here all night?" the high laugh asked. "If I have to," I said. And the way the wind took those words made them sound like a vow said in a church I would never enter again. They measured me with their eyes like tailors who meant to misfit a man on purpose. Then they gathered their lanterns and shifted back onto the track. The quiet one looked at the line in the dirt as if he wanted to take it with him. He did not step over it. They left. Their talk thinned to whispers, then to the dry clink of glass on metal, then to the nothing that follows men like that when they've gone back under someone else's roof. I stood until the storm moved close enough to carry the smell of iron into my mouth. Then I picked up the feed sack and walked it to the edge of the widow's camp and set it down where the ground had remembered the shape of many empty sacks before it. I did not look at her. It is easier for pride to accept help from a stranger if the stranger seems not to care whether the help is taken. Still, I heard her voice. "Thank you," she said, as plain as a fact laid between two honest people. The big boy was quiet. The middle one stirred and went back to sleep. The small one whispered something about stars, as if the sack were full of them. "You'll need to trench," I said. "Wind likes to take a tent where it can catch a lip. Dig in along the sides. Use the shallow pan. Pack the soil firm. Stake low. Knot the guy line twice." She nodded. Her hands had already started moving before my words were done. I took the long way around, kept another hour of watch, and then cut a narrow path back to the creek. The mare lifted her head as if to ask what we had learned. Only this I told her in the kind of language you make with reins and breath. "Some nights I won't let you be the man you've promised to be. They insist you become a better one." Snow began as the smallest possible truth, a single flake that melted on my glove and left a dark star upon the leather. I pitched my own canvas under a cottonwood that had survived every storm I'd known. I drank coffee that had no comfort in it except warmth. I listened to the ground talk about the water coming down from the high country. I looked toward the dip in the earth where four shadows had become a family around a small, stubborn light. I told the wind the same old confession and added a line I had not yet dared. "Maybe I can stay." The wind took it. For once, it didn't carry it away. It set it back in my chest, heavier than before, like a thing a man could lift if he remembered how. By dawn, the snow had crusted thin over the flats, and the world looked scrubbed clean of sin. The kind of morning that fools you into thinking mercy might be simple again. My fire had gone to ash. The mare stood patient, her breath rising slow. I poured what was left of the coffee and let the warmth remind me I was still among the living. When the sun pushed the cold off the ridge, I saw the smoke of her small camp twisting low. No sound but a shovel striking half-frozen soil. She was trenching, just like I told her. The oldest boy swung a hatchet at branches so thin They'd burn faster than they'd warm. The other two dragged them toward the tent, heads bent, quiet, in the way of children who've learned to work without being told. I rode down slow, keeping my distance until she looked up. There's a way a person can look at you that makes the distance your burden, not theirs. She didn't smile, just nodded once and went back to it. I tied the mare by the creek and carried over a bundle of canvas I'd patched the night before. "Storm's not done," I said. "You'll want a lean-to for the wood. Keeps it dry enough to burn." She studied the bundle like it might carry strings attached. Then she took it, careful, not grateful, just measured. "You shouldn't be out here," she said. "Town folk will have something to say." "They already did," I told her. "Don't much care for a repeat." The big boy, Daniel, eyed me like a dog guarding a bone too small to share. "We don't need pity," he said. "Good," I said. I don't carry any." He didn't know whether to be offended or relieved. Boys his age still think every kindness is a trick. He'll learn there are worse things than tricks. I showed them how to lash poles into a frame and stretch the canvas tight. The middle one, Ben, had a good eye for knots. The little one, Timmy, followed me like a shadow, too curious to sit still. When he asked if my horse had a name, I told him she'd answer to ma'am, because she'd earned the title. He grinned, the kind of grin that makes a man's heart remember its size. By noon, we'd made a shelter fit to keep them through the blow that was surely on its way. Clouds massed heavy over the ridge, low and bruised. The air carried that taste again. Tin, iron, and something like sorrow you could touch. She brought out a tin cup and offered it. Coffee, thin but warm. I took it. Our fingers brushed, and the contact carried more conversation than words ever could. "Name's Sarah," she said finally. "Jackson," I told her. The name hung there. It had been months since I'd used it out loud. A name is a kind of mirror. Some days you can't stand to see yourself in it. "Why'd you help?" she asked. I stared toward the hills where the snow was beginning to fall in slow, deliberate flakes. Storm's no respecter of names. Seen too many folks lose everything because no one thought to share a match. She nodded, but there was a distance in her eyes, one built by debt, not gratitude. She didn't want to owe me. Didn't want her boys thinking a stranger's hands could fix what the world had broken. Pride and pain make a tight braid. We worked till dusk, digging a trench deeper around the tent, stacking kindling under the lean-to. When the light went soft, I made to leave. But the wind shifted, hard and sudden. The sky rolled black over itself. A wall of snow was coming fast from the north. You can smell it before it hits, sharp and hollow, like the breath of a god tired of forgiveness. "Get inside," I said. "Now." Sarah gathered the boys without argument. Canvas flapped, stakes groaned. I pulled the ropes tight, drove 2 extra pegs, then slipped into the small tent just as the world outside vanished into white. It's a strange thing, that moment when wind becomes sound. The tent buckled and swayed, snow piling heavy against one side. The boys huddled close, eyes wide in the dark. I could see my breath and theirs mingling like ghosts, unsure which way to go. Timmy started to cry, quiet at first, then with the kind of sob that steals air from the room. Sarah held him, whispering things only mothers know how to make true. Daniel clenched his jaw, watching me like he'd fight me if I moved wrong. I struck a match, cupped it in my hand, lit the small oil lamp near the floor. Its glow painted her face gold and shadow, and for a moment the storm outside wasn't stronger than that light. "Ever seen one like this?" she asked. "Once," I said. "I never didn't end well." I told her about the blizzard 3 winters back, about the trail, the freight wagon, the miles I thought I could beat before nightfall, about finding my house half buried in the silence that came after. The words felt like stones I'd been carrying too long. She didn't say sorry, just listened, eyes steady, as if she knew the weight of things unsaid. "Sometimes," she said softly, "we think survival's living, but it's just breathing, isn't it? Until someone gives you a reason to do more," I said. Outside, the wind howled like the world had something to mourn. The tent creaked. One rope snapped and I pushed out into the cold to tie it back. Snow stung my face like grit, but I got it fastened. When I crawled back in, my coat was white, and Sarah's hands reached out, brushed the ice from my collar. Her touch was quick, almost shy, but it found something I thought had died. With the last fire I ever called home. The storm raged for hours. We took turns tending the small lamp, feeding it drops of oil to keep the dark from swallowing us whole. The boys drifted to sleep one by one. When only the hiss of wind remained, she spoke again. "You can stay till morning," she said, "if the tent holds." "Wouldn't mind," I said, "not much waiting for me elsewhere." She smiled at that, small, but it reached the edges of her eyes. That's the worst kind of truth. When sleep finally came, it was uneasy, full of half-remembered warmth and faces blurred by snow. I dreamed of home, of voices calling from another time. When I woke, dawn was pale through the canvas, and the wind had gone quiet. Outside, the world glittered clean again. But I knew better. Snow only hides the mess until thaw. The snow had laid its blanket across the plains, smooth as the sheet they pull over a body. The world was quiet. In that way, it only gets after a storm, when every living thing is too tired to speak. I stepped outside the tent, and the cold bit through my coat like it was made of lace. The sky was a thin blue, the kind that looks brittle enough to crack if you breathe too hard. Behind me, I heard the boys stirring, the sound of small lives waking up to another day they weren't sure they wanted. Sarah came out last, pulling her shawl tight. Her hair was damp with the frost that sneaks in when you're too tired to notice. She looked at the sky and said, "If we're lucky, the creek won't freeze." "Luck's got little to do with it," I told her. "Creek freezes when it's ready." She gave me a small look, half smile, half warning. That kind of talk gets a man lonely. "Already there," I said. She almost laughed. It was a quiet thing, a sound like thawing ice sliding off a roof. For a heartbeat, that sound filled the empty space between us. Then she turned toward the tent to check on the boys, and I watched the hem of her coat drag through the snow, leaving a small trail that the wind didn't dare cover. We spent the morning cutting wood, stacking it in the lean-to. Daniel kept his distance, swinging the hatchet like he had something to prove. The middle boy, Ben, followed every instruction with the kind of focus that belongs to children who know mistakes cost more than time. Timmy tottered behind me, collecting twigs and humming something off-key. He asked if snowflakes ever get lonely falling alone. I didn't have an answer good enough for that kind of question. By noon, we got a fire big enough to dry our boots and melt the ice off our coats. Sarah brewed what passed for coffee, poured it into a tin cup, and handed it to me. Her hands were red and raw from the cold, but steady. "Town won't like that you're here," she said after a while. "They didn't like I was there either," I told her. She nodded, eyes on the flame. "You talk like a man who's seen too much and ain't sure if he's done. Maybe I'm just a man who's tired of watching good people freeze." That got her quiet. The fire cracked, sent sparks up that disappeared into the gray. For a long stretch, we said nothing. Out here, silence isn't empty. It's a kind of language. You learn to read it the way others read letters on a page. When the sun began to tilt west, the sky turned the color of bruised fruit. The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of wood smoke and something else. Horse sweat, leather, men. I knew that scent. Trouble had found its way back. 3 riders came out of the haze, not the same as before, but cut from the same cloth. One carried a paper in his hand, like it might turn to gold if he waved it right. They pulled up at the edge of the camp, horses snorting, snow crunching beneath their hooves. "You Sarah Mayfield?" the one in front asked. She stood straight, wiped her hands on her skirt. "I am." He held up the paper. "You're squatting on Mercer land. This here says he's got claim to every acre from the ridge down to the creek. You've got till sundown tomorrow to clear out." Sarah didn't flinch. "We were told this land was open for homesteading. That was before Mercer bought it off a man who never filed right. His now. Law says so." I stepped forward then. Law's got a way of bending for the man who pays its feed bill. The rider looked me over, smirked. "You part of this?" "Just someone who hates to see folks pushed in the snow while men with papers talk about fairness." He spat into the fire. "You talk like you know Mercer." "I know his kind," I said. The man chuckled. "Then you know better than to stand between him and what's his." "I do," I said, "but I've also learned some things ain't his no matter what's on paper." He stared at me a beat longer than comfort allowed, then turned his horse. "Tomorrow at sundown," he said again. "Don't be here to see the fire start." They rode off, the snow swallowing the sound of their hooves until there was nothing but wind again. Sarah watched them go, her hands trembling, though she tried to hide it. "He means it," she said. "I know," I said. "You can't stop him." "Maybe not, but he'll know he was stopped for a while." She looked at me then, really looked, as if weighing what kind of man would stand against a name like Mercer. "Why?" she asked. "Why risk anything for us?" I poked the fire, watched the embers flare. "Because once someone needed me, and I didn't come." That ended the dock. When night came, we sat around the fire. The boys drifted into sleep. Sarah sewed a tear in her youngest coat, her fingers moving slow but sure. I watched the way the lamplight caught her face, the kind of face the years had carved lines into but hadn't stolen its softness. "Mercer'll send more than words next time," I said quietly. "I know," she answered, "but so will you." Her eyes met mine then, steady, unflinching, the kind that can make a man believe he's not lost after all. I took a breath, slow and heavy, and said the thing that had been pressing against my ribs since the storm began. "If you let me stay a spell, I can help you build something stronger than canvas." Sarah didn't answer right away. She finished the last stitch, bit the thread, and looked up at me through the smoke. "We'll see what tomorrow brings." Outside, the wind carried the first howl of another storm. Or maybe it was just the prairie remembering our names. Morning came like a bruise, deep, slow, and tender to the touch. The snow had stopped, but the cold hadn't. The world wore its silence heavy, and even the sun seemed hesitant to rise. I woke to the sound of a pot rattling and the faint clink of tin. Sarah was already up, stirring what little oats she'd saved. The boys sat close to the fire, rubbing their hands, trying to chase the sleep from their bones. I stepped out, stretched my back, and watched the light crawl across the flats. A coyote trotted the ridgeline, tail low, nose down. You could tell the kind of hunger in its gait, the same kind that follows people too proud to beg and too honest to steal. Daniel came up beside me, the hatchet hanging from his hand. He didn't say good morning, just stood there, jaw set like his mother's. "You gonna fight those men when they come?" he asked. "Depends on what they bring." I said, "They'll bring guns." "Then maybe I'll bring reason." He snorted. "That don't work out here." "No," I said, "not often." He stared at me like he was trying to decide if I was fool or a liar. Then he went back to chopping wood. Every strike, a word he didn't have the courage or patience to say. I knew that kind of silence, wore it myself for years. After breakfast, I rode into town. Sarah didn't ask where or why, but the question sat between us. I told her I'd be back before sundown. She didn't tell me to be careful, but her eyes did. The road to Willow Flats was a ribbon of mud and thaw. My mare slogged through steady, nostrils puffing small ghosts into the cold. The town sat quiet, still nursing its hangover from last night's warmth. Folks nodded, but didn't speak. They'd heard whispers already. The widow, her boys, the stranger, the kind of story people tell when they need to remind themselves they're better. I tied up outside the mercantile. The same clerk from before was sweeping the porch, his broom pushing more dust than snow. He looked up when he saw me, the way a man looks at something that might upset his day. "Morning," I said. He nodded, but didn't say it back. "If you're looking for work, Mercer's always hiring strong backs. I'm not here for wages." "Then you're here for trouble." "Maybe," I said. "I bought nails, kerosene, salt, and a coil of rope." As I laid my coins down, he asked, "You settling near the Mayfield place?" "No one settled yet," I said. "No, but maybe that's what I'm fixing." He didn't answer, just stared at me like a man reading a sentence he couldn't make sense of. When I stepped back out, I saw the sheriff leaning against the post outside the saloon, badge tarnished, hat tilted back, eyes dull. Sheriff Webb, old enough to know better, but not old enough to stop trying to look brave. "Heard you're meddling," he said, voice lazy. "Just helping a family." He spat in the snow. "You know whose land that is?" "I know whose ink says it is." He studied me for a beat, thumb running slow over the star on his vest. "Mercer keeps this town fed. Ain't much law can stand up to an empty belly." "Then maybe it's time someone tried." He shook his head, half amused, half tired. "You talk like a man with nothing to lose." "Maybe I am." He gave a dry chuckle. "That's the dangerous kind." I left him there polishing a badge that hadn't shined in years. By the time I reached the ridge again, the sky was folding into gray. Snowmelt trickled through the cuts in the land like veins too stubborn to freeze. The smell of wood smoke guided me home. Sarah was outside, mending the wagon wheel. Her hands worked quick, sure. Daniel watched me ride up but didn't wave. Ben was tending the fire, Timmy chased after the mayor's shadow like it was some new game the world had made just for him. "You went to town," Sarah said without looking up. "I did." "See the sheriff?" "I did." "And?" "He's afraid." She tied off the rope she was using and finally looked at me. "Fear makes men foolish. Sometimes it makes them dangerous." Her mouth tightened. "And you? What about me? What does fear make you?" I thought about that for a long breath. "Still here, Ma," I said. "That night, the wind changed again. You could feel it shift, a subtle thing, but certain, the kind of change animals sense before men do. I stood outside, watching the horizon swallow the last of the light. I could smell the kerosene, the rope, the storm that wasn't made of weather. When the first hoofbeats came, I was already awake. 3 riders again, maybe 4, cutting through the dark with the confidence of men who think the world belongs to them. I didn't wake the boys. I didn't wake Sarah. I just stepped out into the cold, shotgun resting easy in my hands, and waited by the fire that refused to die down. The riders pulled up 10 yards from the lean-to. Mercer wasn't with them, but his kind never rides first. "You've had your warning," one of them called. "Time to clear out." Sarah stepped beside me before I could speak, her coat pulled tight, face steady. "We're not leaving," she said. The man spat into the snow. "Then burn with it." He raised the torch, and that was the moment. Right there, where the past I'd been running from caught up with me. Because I'd seen this before. I'd ridden into storms trying to outrun the sound of fire. But there comes a time when running isn't living. It's just dying slower. I stepped forward into the light, into the memory, into the part of the story I swore I'd never tell again. And I said, quiet but certain, "Not tonight." He froze when he heard it. That quiet, level tone that doesn't shout because it doesn't have to. The torch in his hand flickered, spitting a tail of flame that bent in the wind. The others shifted in their saddles, looking to one another for what to do next. Every gang has its hierarchy. One man who speaks, one who laughs, one who shoots, and one who waits to see which way the fire blows. I stepped closer, just enough for the firelight to catch my face. The scar across my cheek glinted faintly, and I saw in their eyes that small hitch. Recognition of something they couldn't name, but didn't want to meet. "You don't want to do this," I said. The rider holding the torch sneered. "You think I'm asking?" "No," I said, slow and even. "I think you're hoping no one will make you." He spat. "We ain't hoping, friend. We're working orders." "Mercer's orders?" The name hung there like the scent of gun oil. The others shifted again. None of them liked how it sounded. Out loud, in the cold. A name like Mercer doesn't ride well in the open air. Behind me, I felt Sarah move closer. I could sense her hand brush the side of the tent, steadying herself, not me. She wasn't afraid. Not in the trembling way fear takes some people. No, hers was the kind that stands still, watches, and decides which piece of the world is worth saving. "Take your boys inside," I said over my shoulder. She didn't move. "They deserve to see what kind of men walk this earth," she said. The one with the torch laughed, though it came out thin. "Ain't no lesson here 'cept this. What Mercer owns, he keeps." "You ever ask yourself what he's keeping?" I asked him. "Land, pride, or just his name on someone else's misery?" "Don't matter," another man said. "Our job's to make sure folks remember who runs this valley." I looked him dead on. And if I make sure they remember who stood against it. For a moment, none of them spoke. The wind hissed through the cottonwoods, that old desert voice muttering prayers or curses. Sometimes you can't tell which. The torchbearer grinned, but I could see the crack in it. You're one man. Sometimes that's enough, I said. I could feel Daniel behind me now, stepping out from the tent, half grown, but already old in his eyes. He didn't have a weapon, but the way he stood made one out of him. Sarah didn't stop him. She only said, "Stay behind Jackson." The riders muttered among themselves. One pulled his horse a few feet back, nervous. Another reached for the flask in his coat, pretending to warm his hands. The torch wavered. "Go home," I said. "Tell Mercer to come himself next time." "You don't want that," the man said. "I do," I told him. Been a while since I looked the devil straight and saw how small he really was. His jaw tightened. Pride's a hard thing to swallow, with an audience watching. He hurled the torch toward the lean-to, maybe hoping to earn his pay with one easy throw. But I was already moving. I caught it mid-flight, the flames licking close enough to bite the sleeve of my coat. It burned through the canvas in a flash of orange before I jammed it into the snow. Steam hissed up, thick and fast. When the smoke cleared, the men saw what I'd done, and something shifted between us. "You're making a mistake," one of them said. "Maybe," I answered, "but it's mine to make." They hesitated just long enough for the first sound of hooves to reach us. From the ridge, far off but certain, I turned my head slightly, listening. The men did too. There's a rhythm to honest riders, the kind who come because they've seen smoke and can't sit still. The first lantern crested the hill, then another, then two more. Ranchers from the neighboring valley, men I'd traded with, ridden beside in other storms. Good men, tired, poor, but decent. The three riders in front of me looked small suddenly, like boys caught stealing grain. The torchbearer cursed under his breath. "You brought company," he muttered. "No," I said, "they brought themselves." He turned his horse sharply, jerking the reins. "This ain't over." "It's never over," I said. "That's the curse of men like you." They rode off, their shapes melting into the dark until only the sound of hooves faded into the cold. The ranchers arrived a few minutes later. Tom Beasley was the first to dismount. Big man, beard frosted white, coat 2 sizes too thin. "Saw light. Thought you'd need a hand," he said. "Appreciate it," I told him. He glanced at the tent, at Sarah standing tall behind me, at the boys half hidden in the glow of the fire. "Mercer's men again." "His paper," I said. "His threats. Same as always." Tom spat in the snow. "Oh, Mercer don't scare the weather, and he sure as hell don't own the land God made flat." He nodded toward the others. "We'll stand witness, if it comes to that. Sheriff can't ignore 10 men saying the same truth." Sarah stepped forward. "Why would you risk that?" Tom smiled, small but real. "'Cause every man gets one night to choose what kind he is. Reckon this one's ours." The wind eased for the first time that evening, and I could feel the storm moving off east. The ranchers stayed till the sky lightened a shade toward gray, keeping watch, sharing coffee gone bitter from too many boils. Before dawn, they left one by one, their tracks trailing out across the frozen flats. I stood till the last lantern disappeared behind the ridge. When I turned, Sarah was still there, arms folded against the cold. "You didn't have to stand between us and them," she said. Maybe not, I told her, but I had to stand somewhere. She looked at me for a long time, long enough for the sun to break through the clouds and set the world to gold. And then, in that small voice she kept hidden beneath her strength, she said, "Then maybe you should stay." For the first time in years, I felt warmth that didn't come from fire. I stayed, not because I thought I could fix anything, but because the ground itself seemed to ask me to. There's a weight to land that's been fought over. It remembers the men who bled for it, the women who built on it, and the ghosts who never left. I'd been drifting too long to ignore a place that still had a pulse. The days came slow after that, but steady. We worked, cut timber from the cottonwood grove, and dragged it down piece by piece. Repaired the wagon axle with bolts from town. Daniel learned how to set a post straight. Ben learned to patch a roof seam without wasting a nail. And little Timmy followed me like a dog learning faith. Sarah handled the rest, washing for the ranchers who'd stood with us, sewing clothes in exchange for flour or a bit of coffee. She never said thank you, not once, but she didn't have to. The way she'd leave an extra slice of bread cooling on the stump where I sharpened tools was enough. Some nights, after the boys were asleep, we'd sit by the fire outside and let the stars do the talking. She'd mend something small, a glove, a hem, and I'd whittle just to keep my hands busy. The firelight would paint her face in amber and shadow, and I'd catch myself thinking how a person could look like home without even trying. "Why'd you come west?" she asked one night. "To forget," I said. She nodded, like she already knew. "And did you?" I tossed the wood chip into the fire. "No, but I remembered what I should have been." The night went quiet again. Somewhere far off, a coyote sang to the dark, lonely and proud all at once. She looked at the horizon like she could see through it. "I used to think the West was where people came to start over," she said. "It is," I told her, "but most don't make it past the starting." The next morning, I rode into town again, not for supplies, for signs. The mercantile man looked at me with that same suspicion, but he didn't speak. Outside the saloon, Sheriff Webb was pacing the porch, twisting his hat in his hands. He looked older, weaker somehow. "You made quite a stir," he said when he saw me. "Men protecting their own land shouldn't stir a thing," I said. "Mercer don't see it that way. He's filed papers in Bisbee. Claims your widow's claim ain't worth the dirt she's standing on." "She's not my widow," I said. Then I added, "Not yet." The sheriff's brows lifted. Careful, Jackson. Mercer's got men in every corner of this county, and he's got friends that don't wear stars." "Friends," I said, "or cowards." He flinched, but he didn't argue. "I can't protect you," he said quietly. "Didn't ask you to." I left him there, chewing on his badge like it was penance. By the time I made it back, the wind had shifted. Clouds gathered heavy in the south, promising more snow. Sarah was hauling water from the creek. Daniel and Ben were splitting logs. Timmy was crouched by the mare, humming to her softly, his little fingers brushing the frost off her flank. "You went to town," Sarah said, not asking. "I did." "Mercer? He's not done." She nodded once. "He never is." We worked in silence for a while. Then she said, "You could go. You've done more than anyone had the right to ask." I leaned on the shovel, studying her face. "You want me gone?" "I don't want you dead," she said. I thought about that. About the graves under the cottonwoods 3 winters back. about the woman whose voice the snow still carried in my dreams. I thought about Sarah's boys, about the way Timmy's laughter sounded like something the world forgot to take. Maybe I'm already half dead, I said. Maybe staying's the only thing that makes me feel alive. Her eyes softened. Then stay, but don't do it for me. That night, the wind came howling down the ridge again. I woke to the sound of something banging against the side of the lean-to. Not wind, not branches. A horse. I stepped out with the rifle in hand. The moonlight showed the outline of a man slumped in the saddle. His coat was torn, his face half covered in blood and frost. I recognized him before he spoke. "Beasley," I said. He nodded weakly, slid off the horse, and hit the ground hard. I caught him by the shoulders. "Mercer," he gasped, "took our cattle, burned the barn, said he's coming for the woman next." Sarah had stepped out now, her shawl wrapped tight, eyes wide. "Is he alone?" I asked. Beasley shook his head. No. Brought 6 men. Maybe more. Sheriff's turned his back. They'll be here before sunup." I carried him inside the tent. Sarah tore strips from an old shirt and started dressing his wounds. I poured him a swallow of whiskey, which he drank like a man already halfway gone. "We'll stop him," I said. Sarah looked up sharply. "Jackson." But I was already loading shells into the shotgun. "No more running." The fire crackled low. Beasley coughed once, blood on his lip. "You can't stand him alone." "I won't," I said, "not this time." Daniel was at the tent flap, eyes fierce, jaw set. "We'll help." "You'll keep your brother safe," I told him. "That's how you help." He wanted to argue, but Sarah put a hand on his shoulder. He stayed quiet, but I saw something change in him. The boy was gone. In his place stood a man who'd already learned what the world demands. Outside, the wind grew sharper, colder. It carried the sound of horses far off, slow, steady, certain. I looked at the horizon and felt that old, terrible calm settle in. The kind of man gets right before the world asks if he's ready to prove what he believes. Sarah came to stand beside me. "You can still leave," she said. "Oh, Mike, I could," I said, "but I won't." The wind whipped her hair across her face, and in that dim, shifting light she looked almost unreal, like something the land itself had conjured to keep men honest. "Then whatever happens," she said softly, "you're home now." Home. The word hit me harder than any bullet ever could. I nodded once. "Then it's time to defend it." The storm was coming, and this time it had a name. We made what plans we could with patched rope and stubborn hope. There's a kind of clarity that comes when the dark presses close. Decisions become simple, and the only thing left is the doing. I set posts along the shallow trench, drove sharpened stakes into the frozen ground, and told Daniel where to stack the kindling for a controlled burn if they tried to torch the lean-to. Ben learned how to make a loop that would hold a ladle or a pot. Timmy practiced carrying water in a bucket without spilling half of it on the snow. Small things maybe, but in a night that smelled like smoke, little things are the sort of weapons that last. We took turns walking to and from the ridge, keeping watch where the land gives you a long answer. I'd ride out and listen for the different heartbeats of men, the way a town gives itself away in the scrapes of boots and the clink of metal. When I'd been younger, I counted time by wagons. Lately, I count by the number of times a lantern appears and disappears on the horizon. It tells me who's coming and who's gone. That night, lanterns came slow and steady, like a prayer being built in the dark. Mercer's men arrived before dawn in a line that made the air seem tighter. They moved with the careful slowness of men who believe the first look wins the fight. I saw their faces lit by lantern light, set blank, paid to do what the proud won't. They dismounted at Mercer's signal, and that's when I saw him. He'd come then, not on horseback, but in a buggy with a canvas top. He stepped down like a man used to, giving orders that took effect because other men feared their names more than their God. Mercer had the kind of face that smiled too much and said too little, like a person who sells insurance for souls. He didn't come alone in reputation. He'd brought paper with him that had been folded and creased by lawyers. He held the documents up like a Bible to the sheriff, who stood by with a look that tried to be impartial and failed. Mercer's voice was honey and grit both. He read the claim slow, savoring the syllables as if they were coins he'd paid with someone else's hope. "You're trespassing," he said, voice practiced. "This land has lawful ownership, and you've been given notice." He looked past the sheriff at Sarah and the boys with the expression of a man who thinks charity is an adjective that should never be put next to people. "Lawful?" I asked. "Is that what you call taking a paper and calling it a life?" He smiled in a way that showed small teeth. "Mr. Jackson, you ought to know the law. It's not rough justice out here, it's protection for investment. Men who put their money into this valley deserve their rights. And what of men who put their sweat into it?" Tom Beasley stepped forward then, shoulders squared, like a man who'd been waiting on a moment to speak. "They deserve a roof and a reason to keep their boys fed." Mercer's smile thinned. "Mr. Beasley, your people are free to buy land like anyone else." "Buy land?" Tom said. "Ain't that the thing Mercer does best? Buy and foreclose on the same breath?" The men near him muttered agreement, the kind that comes from years of being on the losing side of ledgers. Sheriff Webb shifted his weight between them, a man who'd rather see a scuffle from a distance than put his badge where his mouth is. Now, he said, "we can settle this civil-like. Court's the place for papers." Court's a long road for a family with no money for a coach, I thought. Mercer's lawyers had miles in ink. Sarah looked at me then, and there was a kind of resolute ache in her face that made me think of a river pushing a stone until it becomes a part of the bank. "We've been warned," she said. "We'll go if we must." "You will not," I said, quick and cold, "not with men who threaten to burn us." My voice had the flat iron in it then, the part that comes when a man remembers what was taken from him and decides that no child should stand where he once stood. Mercer's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Jackson," he said, "I suggest you remove yourself from this dispute before things get ugly." A laugh went through the ranchers that had heat to it. "We don't need more ugly," Tom said. "We need truth." He spat once into the snow, a private offering. The sheriff cleared his throat and coughed like a man who'd swallowed a stone. "I can't have blood on the streets," he said, which was another way of saying he'd rather blood be someone else's problem. Mercer raised his hand as if calling for calm, but calm is something you don't hand down like a decree. It grows when men who have nothing left decide enough is enough. A murmur ran through the crowd, the kind of sound that sounds like a low tide coming in, quiet at first, then building. I saw movement at the edge of the gathered men, the quiet ones, the types who had kept their mouths shut until the world made a need for noise. Old Joe, who keeps the stock fence mended by himself, spat into his hand and held it out to me as if to say he'd stand. Mike Leland, who had lost a barn to Mercer's men last spring, jerked his head as if to say he'd ride. Faces from other ranches came forward, men who traded goods and stories with me and had the memory of a handshake worth more than gold to them. Mercer looked around and felt the change. He's used to buying his own storms and selling back the shelter afterward. A man like him grows proud in the absence of men who want nothing in return. He saw the ledger of his power thinning. For the first time that night, he seemed unsettled. "You think a crowd makes right?" he asked, and he meant it to sting. "No," I said, "but it makes hard to lie." That night, the standoff held like a picture. Two versions of the valley, one written in ink and the other in sweat. Voices rose and lowered. Threats came and went, and the boys watched, learning how the world tells stories. Timmy's eyes were wide, not with fear so much as astonishment that grown folks had to choose what kind they were in front of such small ears. When the men finally left, Mercer stayed a moment as if to savor defeat or to plan how to buy it back. He nailed his grin one last time and said, "We'll be in touch," then climbed into his buggy and rode off like a man who felt the night was a check he could cash later. The relief we felt was thin as the morning, but it was real. It warmed the bones like coffee. We worked faster the next days, cutting down boards, nailing planks, raising a rough frame that might stand a winter and a stubborn heart. The ranchers came by with food and tools, unasked. They left quietly, as if they'd come into a church and expected no thanks. In their pockets, they carried the satisfaction that comes from doing the right small thing when the world's accounting favors the wrong side. At night, I sat by the new wall we'd raised and felt the hum of life begin to purr under my palms. Sarah worked beside me, slower now, less like a woman bracing for a strike, and more like someone rebuilding a life. The boys argued over the placement of a nail, and Daniel mended a tear in his sleeve with a patience that made me think children can be taught old strengths if shown how. It didn't feel like victory. No war ends with that, but it felt like an acre of ground in a man's chest that had stopped aching. We had defended a place that needed standing for, and in doing so, we made a small space where folks could come and warm themselves. I lay awake some nights after, thinking of that winter when I wasn't there, and of the woman whose laugh the snow had kept. The memory stung like a cold wind under the collar, but now it came with a different edge. It didn't hollow me out. It fit into the parts of me that could be given again. I've been given a second chance, not by law or paper, but by the slow, honest choosing of men who remembered that land binds people as surely as it binds fences. We were ready then, or as ready as a handful of souls can be against a man who signs papers for a living. The next chapter was a thing we all knew could come. A sheriff's summons, a hired gun, a night that asked for too much. But for the first time in a long while, I felt that if it came, we'd meet it not as scattered pieces, but as a set of hands that had learned to hold one another. Winter held on longer than most years. It stayed past its welcome, the way sorrow does when you've stopped asking it to leave. The snow turned to mud, the mud to ice again, and each sunrise carried the same gray promise. Not much would change today. But sometimes Not much is enough. The house we built was rough, gaps between the boards, nails bent from haste, but it stood. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady ribbon, the kind that tells passers-by someone inside believes tomorrow still matters. The boys grew into the work. Daniel cutting wood without being told, Ben learning to mend harness leather, little Timmy feeding the chickens as if they were fragile secrets. Sarah kept it all moving, quiet as a shadow, her hair coming loose in the wind that always found its way through the cracks. And me, I fixed what I could. Roof leaks, squeaky hinges, the ache in my own chest. Some nights, after everyone was asleep, I'd sit outside and listen to the coyotes sing to the same moon I'd cursed 100 times before. The sound didn't haunt me anymore. It just reminded me I wasn't alone in my loneliness. Then came a letter. It was the sheriff who brought it, hat in hand, boots thick with mud. He rode out near dusk, that cautious hour when even lawmen prefer not to be seen. I met him by the fence line. His face looked tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from work, but from watching good men do nothing. Mercer filed suit, he said. Claims you assaulted his men. Claims they were here peaceable, trying to serve notice. Peaceable men don't bring torches, I said. He sighed. Ain't my opinion that counts, Jackson. Papers are signed. Judge'll be in by week's end. You'll be called to answer. What about the others? The ranchers? They'll be called too if they're willing. They will be, I said, though I wasn't sure. Webb looked past me, toward the house. He saw the small shape of Timmy chasing a hen across the yard, the faint glow of the lamp through the window where Sarah stood sewing. You know Mercer won't stop, he said softly. He can't afford to. A man like that builds his power on fear. Let one family defy him and the whole town might remember what backbone feels like. Then let him remember, I said. He shook his head, half a smile, half a pity. You talk like a preacher. I ain't one. No, he said, swinging up into his saddle. But maybe you should have been. He left the letter in my hand. I didn't open it right away. I carried it inside, set it on the table, and let Sarah read it. Her lips moved without sound as her eyes tracked the words. Then she folded it neatly, as though the act itself could keep it from coming true. So it's the law now, she said. Mercer's law, I corrected. She nodded. There's no difference in this valley. There will be, I said, when men start standing together, there will be. She looked at me for a long time, that quiet way she has when she's trying to decide if she can believe me. You think people will risk what little they have left? They already did once. That was firing guns, she said, and this is paper and judges. Different kind of battle. Same truth underneath, I told her. Same right and wrong. That night, we sat around the fire while the boys slept. The house creaked in the wind. Somewhere outside, a shutter banged loose, but neither of us moved to fix it. I used to think God forgot this land, she said quietly. Maybe he just got tired of watching us forget each other, I said. She smiled, just a ghost of one. You talk like a man who believes in second chances. I talk like a man who finally saw one, I said. She reached across the table then, rested her hand over mine. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of touch that says, you're not wandering anymore. When morning came, I saddled up and rode out to gather the men who'd stood with us that night. Beasley, still limping from Mercer's attack, met me first. His barn was half gone, but his eyes were steady. "Judge's hearing," I said. "I heard," he replied. "I'll be there." One by one, they all said the same. Maybe because they meant it. Maybe because they saw what happens when silence becomes habit. The hearing was set for the following Friday. Town hall smelled of ink, sawdust, and cheap whiskey. Mercer stood near the front, dressed too fine for a man who pretended at virtue. His lawyer was the slick sort, hair oiled, voice smooth, every sentence a noose disguised as reason. Sarah sat beside me, the boys in the back, with Beasley and the others. The judge read the claims, slow and flat: trespass, arson, threat of bodily harm. When it was my turn to speak, I stood. My hands were steady, though my heart beat like a drum under the sun. "I didn't come here to fight," I said. "I came because a woman and her sons were being pushed off land no man had the right to own. We built what we could with what we had. The law says that ain't enough, but maybe the law's forgotten who it was made for." The lawyer objected, words sharp as pins. The judge waved him quiet. "Continue," he said. I looked at Mercer then. "A man who buys everything can't understand what a thing is worth. This land wasn't bought. It was earned by calloused hands, by nights too cold for sleep, by a woman's courage when every neighbor turned away. If that's a crime, then I stand guilty." The room went still. You could hear the creak of wood under boots, the breath of men who'd been waiting for someone to say out loud what they'd all been thinking. Beasley stood. "He's right," he said. "We all seen it. Mercer's men brought torches. They meant to burn, not serve papers." Others nodded, one after another, voices rising like wind through dry grass. The judge looked out over the room, face unreadable. When the gavel finally fell, it sounded more like surrender than judgment. "The claim," he said, "is suspended pending further review. The court recognizes the homestead application as lawful until proven otherwise." Sarah's hand gripped mine. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Mercer's jaw worked like he was chewing on stone. He turned without a word and walked out, his boots echoing hard on the floorboards. Outside, the air smelled of thawing earth, that first shy scent of spring. We rode home in silence, the sun low and gold across the hills. Sarah's boys raced ahead on the wagon, laughing, their voices carrying far. When we reached the ridge, she looked at me and said, "You could leave now, if you wanted." "I could," I said, "but I don't." "Why?" I looked out of the house, smoke rising straight and clean into the sky, because I finally believed the words I said. She smiled then, soft and tired and real. "Then maybe," she said, "we all got our second chance." The wind carried the sound of her voice away, not to erase it, but to share it with the land, as if the valley itself was listening. Spring came slow that year, the way forgiveness does when it's been earned the hard way. The frost melted out of the soil like a secret finally confessed. The creek ran full again, quick and silver, carrying with it the last whispers of winter. For the first time in a long while, I woke to birds instead of wind. The house we'd built no longer looked borrowed. It looked lived in. Smoke curled from the chimney each morning, soft and sure. The corral held 2 colts we'd traded for, and the fields, though thin, showed their first shy sprigs of green. Every board, every nail, every patch of roof carried a story written in calloused hands. Sarah would hum sometimes while she worked, a low tune with no words, maybe one she'd known before her life turned rough. The boys had grown sun-browned and louder, as boys should be. Daniel, steady and quiet, had a way of watching the horizon that reminded me of myself before regret took up residence in my bones. Ben was all fire and laughter, always chasing something, fish, dreams, or his younger brother. And little Timmy, he followed me like a stray pup, eyes wide, heart open. One afternoon, while fixing the fence near the creek, he asked, "You ever been lonely, Mr. Jackson?" I smiled at that. "Son, I was born lonely, but it don't sit on me the way it used to." He frowned, thinking. "How'd you make it stop?" I leaned on the post, looking out toward the hills, their tops soft with morning haze. "I didn't. I just found people worth sharing it with." He nodded, solemn as if I'd told him a great secret. Maybe I had. A few weeks later, the ranchers who stood with us rode out again. No papers, no threats, just a wagon full of lumber and laughter. We worked through the day, raising walls for a barn that would stand long after we were dust. It wasn't charity, it was covenant, the kind men make without shaking hands, sealed instead by sweat and respect. That night, after the work was done, we sat by the fire, the whole lot of us, the flames licked high, throwing sparks into a sky thick with stars. Someone passed around coffee so strong it could have shooed death itself. Beasley played a cracked harmonica, slow and sad, the way all good songs are in the West. When the fire burned down to coals and most had ridden home, Sarah lingered by the porch. The light touched her face just enough to show how the years hadn't beaten her. They'd burnished her instead. Ma, you ever think about leaving again?" she asked. Sometimes," I said. "Old habits like to whisper." "And what stops you?" I looked at the boys, sleeping in the doorway, their breaths even, their faces at peace. Then at her, the woman who'd weathered more storms than I had excuses. "Because everything I was looking for is already here," she smiled, faint but full of understanding. "Then you best stay a while longer." The moon was high, spilling silver across the yard. Somewhere down the creek, frogs had begun their slow, steady hymn. I felt the ache in my hands, the weight in my shoulders, but beneath it all was something lighter, a quiet I could live with. Weeks turned to months. The valley began to bloom, wildflowers pushing through the stubborn earth like small rebellions. We built fences, fixed wagons, and planted seed. The sheriff came by once, no hat in hand this time. He tipped it from the saddle, said, "Looks like you folks made something honest out here." "We just gave the land what it asked for," I said. He grinned. "That's more than most men ever do." Then he rode off, and I never saw him look back. There were nights I still woke before dawn, heart racing, caught between what was and what is. I'd step outside, breathe deep the cold, and let the world remind me it keeps turning whether I'm ready or not. The stars above felt closer now, not like eyes watching, but like old friends keeping quiet company. One evening, Sarah found me sitting on the porch, staring west. "You're thinking again," she said. "Always am." "About the past." I shook my head. "About the promise I made." She tilted her head. "And what promise is that?" I looked at her, then out toward the hills, their edges soft against the dawn light. That I'd never run again. That when I found a place worth calling home, I'd stay and see it through. She stepped closer, her hand finding mine. "And do you think you found it?" The air was still, carrying only the scent of cedar and the faint hum of the creek. I squeezed her hand, slow and certain. "We're home now," I said, all accepted. She smiled then, eyes bright in the half-dark, and for a long while neither of us spoke. The fire inside the house crackled. The boys stirred in their sleep, and the world outside stretched endless and forgiving. I'd spent years chasing redemption down empty trails, thinking it was something a man earned through penance or prayer. Turns out, it was quieter than that. It was a tent turned into a home, a widow's voice, soft in the dark, a boy's hand in mine, and maybe, just maybe, it was this: the sound of peace settling in your chest after a lifetime of running from it.